A Marine, a broken dog, and a little girl no one believed in. It started at a rescue center outside a snow-covered Colorado base the day Staff Sergeant Jake Carter met Max, the K-9, marked dangerous. 3 weeks later, that same dog was sitting beside a child who'd lost her parents, guarding her as if she were his mission. What happened in between will leave you speechless. Don't miss this story of courage and redemption. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe second chances can save more than one soul. Snow slanted across the parking lot of Jefferson County Animal Rescue, fine as salt and just as cold. Staff Sergeant Jake Carter sat behind the wheel of his pickup engine, idling eyes fixed on the pale outline of the low concrete building. Orders had brought him here, not the kind written in bold type with coordinates and a timeline, but the quiet kind that carried a warning inside the words. Temporary reassignment pending investigation. 3 days earlier, a training explosion on base had gone wrong. His K-9 partner had panicked, his handler had been injured, and command needed someone to blame. The dog Max had been shipped here for observation. Jake had been sent to assist. In truth, both were under review, both on a leash. He stepped out into the wind, the cold biting at his neck, and walked through the front doors. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over linoleum floors that smelled faintly of bleach and fear. A woman at the counter looked up. "You're Carter," she said. "They told me you'd come from the base." He nodded once, offered no handshake. "Director's waiting for you in the back," she said. "Down that hall." Jake followed the sound of barking and the faint echo of his boots until he found Director Nora Price, a woman in her 50s. Practical gray hair tied back, eyes sharp but not unkind. She handed him a clipboard before he spoke. "You'll be helping with basic care, feedings, cleaning, walks if they're cleared." Her voice was efficient, used to thin budgets and long days. Then, more softly, "We also have a special case. I believe you know him." She led him through a narrow corridor lined with kennels, each holding a blur of movement, a whine or a silence that meant the animal had stopped expecting rescue. The hallway ended at a heavy metal door marked Isolation Ward. When she opened it, the smell changed colder, metallic, edged with disinfectant. "Max," she said quietly. "Former military working dog. They sent him here 2 weeks ago." Jake didn't need the explanation. He could have picked out that bark anywhere. He stepped forward, pulse ticking faster though his face stayed blank. Behind the mesh of the final cage, a German shepherd stood still, eyes catching the fluorescent light like polished amber. The dog's coat had dulled, his ribs showed faintly through. There was a white scar along his left foreleg, a map of some old violence. "He's labeled unfit for reconditioning," Nora said. "But he's calm with a steady handler." "I thought you should take him." "I'm not training that dog again," Jake said evenly. The words felt heavier than he meant them to. "I didn't ask you to," she replied. "Just see to his care, feed him, clean his run, be consistent. He doesn't trust change." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but something beneath it, pity maybe, made Jake look away. He crouched near the gate. Max's ears pricked forward, his muscles taut. For a long second, they stared at each other through the narrow pattern of steel. Jake spoke quietly. "Morning, Max. Guess you and I are grounded." The dog's gaze didn't flicker. A low growl started in his chest, but never fully formed. It was warning without malice, muscle memory of a soldier who no longer knew his battlefield. "He still remembers," Jake said. Nora nodded. "They always do." She left him with a clipboard of feeding times, leaving the door to the hallway open. The sounds of the shelter drifted back in the rattle of a mop bucket, the bark of something small and hopeful. Jake knelt again, easing a bowl of water through the lower slot. Max didn't lunge. He waited until Jake's hands were clear before stepping forward to drink. The sound of his tongue against the metal bowl was steady, almost meditative. It loosened something in Jake's chest he hadn't realized was locked. He cleaned the other kennels, ticking off boxes on the clipboard. The work was repetitive, wipe, rinse, replace bedding, and in its simplicity there was a kind of mercy. For once, nobody was shouting orders. When he circled back to Max, the dog was sitting, not pacing, watching him. Jake paused. "You're quieter than I remember," he murmured. The dog blinked once, slow, a truce of sorts. Outside the narrow window, wind blew snow sideways. It caught in the fence wire, making ghostly ribbons that vanished as quickly as they formed. For a moment, Jake could almost pretend the world was simple again, that this place was just another duty post, that the only thing asked of him was patience. Then a sound echoed faintly from the lobby, a laugh small and high, a child's laugh. It broke through the monotone rhythm of barking and machinery like sunlight sneaking through cloud. Jake turned his head toward it, instinctively alert, though he couldn't say why. The laugh came again, softer this time, followed by a voice he didn't recognize. He filed it away without meaning to. Marines learned early to note every variable. He finished the cleaning, made a final check of the locks, and stood. 1,600 hours, he told Max, as if schedules could still hold meaning. "I'll be back then." He started for the door, the dog's head tilted slightly, eyes following. No growl now, no challenge, just recognition. Jake stopped, one hand on the handle, feeling the weight of that look. "Don't start thinking this means anything," he said under his breath, but the words were mostly for himself. When he stepped outside, the cold hit him sharp. He zipped his jacket, walked to his truck, and stood there a long time before getting in. The shelter lights glowed behind him, yellow and distant against the gray sky. He told himself this was temporary, a week, 2 at most. He told himself there was nothing here he hadn't already lost once before. Then from inside the building a bark rang out. Short, precise, familiar. It echoed across the empty lot like a call answered after years of silence. Jake froze, one hand on the door, until the wind carried the sound away. When he finally climbed into the truck, he didn't turn the key right away. He sat there, eyes on the building, and realized he'd already memorized the pattern of the lights inside. By the next morning, the storm had cleared, leaving a brittle sky that made every sound sharper. Jake arrived early, his boots crunching through a thin crust of snow. Inside, the rescue center felt half asleep, the air heavy with the smell of disinfectant and the low rhythm of animals waiting for something they couldn't name. He followed the routine. Nora had given him water bowls, clean straw check locks, and though his hands moved automatically, his thoughts kept circling the same point, the bark that had chased him out to the truck the night before. When he reached Max's kennel, the dog was already awake, tail still but eyes alert. "Morning," Jake said quietly, setting down the new water. Max didn't growl this time. "Progress, maybe." Jake worked until the hallway lights brightened fully, and then voices drifted in from the lobby, 2 adults and a child. The tone was the kind used with care, soft and deliberate. "Just take your time, sweetheart," one woman said. Jake didn't pay much attention until Nora's voice joined in, lower, more formal. "We're happy to have you, Grace." The name carried lightly down the hall, unfamiliar, yet clear. Minutes later, the group came into view at the corridor's end, Nora leading a young woman in a wool coat and a small girl walking half a step behind. The girl's coat was too big, sleeves swallowing her hands. Her hair fell over one eye. The other watched the kennels with the steady focus of someone measuring distance rather than danger. Jake Nora called, "This is Grace Miller, and her foster mom, Lauren. Grace will be joining our animal care program." Jake wiped his hands on a towel and nodded. "Nice to meet you." Grace gave a small nod back, not shy exactly, just careful. Lauren smiled quickly. Her therapist thought being around animals might help. She used to have a dog. There was a silence that suggested the sentence had another half one she didn't want to finish. Nora clapped her hands lightly. "Let's start the tour." They moved down the corridor, Nora explaining routines and rules. The dogs barked, some with excitement, others from habit. Grace didn't flinch, didn't step closer either. She kept pace, eyes flicking from cage to cage, absorbing everything. When they reached the last turn, Jake lingered near Max's ward. He hadn't planned to introduce anyone to that kennel yet. Max was unpredictable, and command oversight made him cautious. But Grace slowed as they passed, gaze catching on the metal door with its red warning label. "What's in there?" she asked. Nora hesitated. "That one's special," she said. "He's not ready for visitors." "Is he sick?" Grace asked. "No," Jake said before Nora could answer. "Just a little hard to trust." He didn't intend to sound defensive, but his tone made Nora glance at him. Grace tilted her head, curiosity brightening her face. "Can I see him?" "Not today," Nora said gently. "Let's start with the easier ones." They continued down the row, and soon the girl was crouched by a golden retriever that pressed its muzzle against the bar's tail, wagging so hard it rattled the door. "This one's nice," Lauren said, crouching beside her. "You can pet him." Grace smiled politely, but her eyes drifted back toward the isolation door. Jake caught it, the kind of pull that doesn't make sense yet refuses to fade. He finished his checklist and turned toward his office. 10 minutes later, voices rose again, small footsteps echoing in the side corridor. He rounded the corner and saw Grace standing alone in front of Max's cage. The adults were at the far end talking with Nora. Grace's hand rested on the gate fingers, spread wide but not reaching through. Max was standing now, alert but not tense, head low, ears halfway back. "Hey there," she said softly. Her voice carried the calm of someone speaking to themselves rather than expecting an answer. "You look like you don't belong here either." Jake froze halfway down the hall. He knew how quickly stillness could break into motion, but Max didn't lunge. He simply stared at her chest, expanding slowly. Grace didn't move closer. "I know that look," she whispered. "When you're somewhere you don't want to be, and everyone's too loud about it." Jake stepped forward quietly until he was beside her. "Grace," he said, keeping his voice low, "that one's not ready for visitors." She looked up, calm and direct. "He didn't growl," she said. Jake blinked. "That's true." He nodded toward the far door. "Let's give him some space, all right." She nodded and followed him back toward the others, glancing over her shoulder once. Max had moved to the front of the cage, standing exactly where she'd been, as if measuring her absence. Nora didn't ask questions, only thanked Jake for helping keep things orderly. Grace and Lauren stayed another hour, meeting the gentler dogs, learning how to fill bowls and fold blankets. When they left, Grace turned once more toward the isolation door. Jake caught her look and recognized something he'd seen in soldiers before, the quiet recognition between two beings who'd both been misplaced. After they were gone, he went to Max's kennel to double-check the latch. The dog's eyes followed him, not hostile, not wary, just fixed. "You made a new friend," Jake said, trying to sound detached. Max's ears twitched and he sat down. The motion was smooth, deliberate, almost human. Jake sighed. "Yeah," he said, "me too. Maybe." Outside, the afternoon light flattened, turning the snow the color of steel. Jake finished his rounds in silence. When he finally locked up for the evening, he paused at the lobby's glass door. Through the reflection, he could still see Max pacing once before settling down again like a sentry returning to his post. The following morning arrived gray and windless, the kind of silence that made sound feel heavier when it came. Jake parked in his usual spot behind the rescue center and went straight to the back corridor, his steps measured and quiet. Nora was already there, arms crossed, speaking with one of the younger staff, a man named Cole, who handled routine cleanings. Their voices carried tension like a taut rope ready to snap. Cole turned as Jake approached, lifting a bandaged hand. "He caught me yesterday," he said. "Through the bars. Didn't even see him move." The white wrap around his wrist looked fresh, still creased from medical tape. Nora sighed. "Max?" she asked, though they all knew the answer. Cole nodded, jaw tight. "I was changing the water bowl." He lunged without warning. Jake studied the man's posture, more shaken than angry, and felt a low churn of guilt. "He reacts to sudden movement," Jake said. "That's on his record." "I read the record," Cole shot back, but Nora cut in before the air thickened further. "Enough," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Carter, I know you've worked with dogs like him, but I need you to understand this one's on thin ice. Any more incidents and the board will recommend euthanasia. I don't like it, but I can't argue with policy." Jake nodded, though something inside him bristled at the word policy. He had lived under rules built on necessity, not paperwork, and knew how fast they could erase what didn't fit. "I'll handle his care alone from now on," he said. Nora studied him, weighing the risk, then gave a small nod. "Be careful." After they left, Jake stood in front of Max's kennel for a long minute. The dog watched him with unreadable eyes, as if waiting to see which version of him would show up today, the soldier, the caretaker, or the man who didn't yet know who he was. "You're not making this easy," Jake muttered, setting down the new bowl slowly. Max didn't move. The only sound was the steady hum of the ventilation system, the kind of white noise that filled spaces where trust hadn't yet grown. Jake worked through the morning following routine with military precision, but something about the way Max watched him changed. The dog's gaze wasn't aggressive anymore. It was calculating, almost questioning. By afternoon, the shelter had filled with the low bustle of volunteers coming in for weekend hours. Grace wasn't among them that day, but her name drifted through Jake's mind when he saw another group of children touring the kennels, their laughter echoing faintly through the hall. He caught himself glancing toward the door each time he heard smaller footsteps, though he couldn't have said why. When closing time came, Nora left early to meet the vet, leaving Jake to lock up. The sky outside had gone soft with evening light snow reflecting the faint orange glow of the street lamps. He took his time with the checklist, making sure each latch was secure. When he reached Max's cage, he noticed something new near the corner, a small square of folded paper just inside the bars. For a second, he thought it was part of the feed packaging, but then he saw the careful handwriting in pencil, faint but deliberate. He crouched down, staying outside the line of the cage, and read the words aloud under his breath. "Everyone's scared. I'm not." He knew that handwriting. Grace. Somehow, during her last visit, she had slipped the note through the bars. The thought made his chest tighten, equal parts concern and something softer he didn't want to name. He looked up. Max was lying down, head resting on his paws, eyes open and steady. The paper lay inches from his nose. Jake half expected to find it shredded, but the edges were intact, unchewed. "You left it there," he said quietly. Max blinked once, slow and deliberate. "You could have torn it to pieces." The dog's tail shifted once against the straw, not wagging, just moving enough to disturb the dust. Jake slid the food tray in and waited while Max ate. His movements were cautious but calm. When he was done, he nudged the bowl aside and lay back down, nose near the folded note again. Jake exhaled slowly. "Guess she's got through to you," he said. He stayed there longer than usual, sitting on the cold floor, elbows on his knees, watching the dog breathe. The note seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, a tiny act of defiance against fear. He thought of Grace's quiet voice, the way she'd looked at Max as if seeing something worth saving. Maybe she was the only one who didn't see danger in those eyes. Or maybe she did, and simply refused to look away. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the loose chain on the gate. Jake gathered his tools, locked up, and turned off the corridor lights. Before leaving, he glanced back through the small window in the isolation door. Max was still awake, not pacing, just watching the dark. The paper sat where it had been untouched. For the first time since the reassignment began, Jake felt something shift. A quiet recognition that loyalty wasn't always loud, that courage could be as small as a child's handwritten promise. As he stepped into the night, he pulled his jacket tighter, realizing the cold didn't sting as much as it used to. Somewhere behind him, a single bark echoed, once low and restrained like a signal sent rather than a warning. He smiled faintly. Message received, he murmured, and walked toward the truck. The following day broke with a sun too bright for the season, the light cutting across the snow like a blade. Jake arrived early again, though he no longer needed to. Routine had become habit. Habit had become a kind of quiet. The shelter was still just the hum of the heaters and the faint clink of metal bowls against tile. He checked the roster, filled out the log, and moved through the morning work without thought. Max watched him from behind the bars, calm but alert eyes steady and unblinking. The folded paper was still in the same place, pushed gently against the corner of the cage, unchewed, as if it had become part of the room. Jake noticed it every time and tried not to think about what that meant. Around noon, Nora appeared with a folder under her arm. Command sent additional files, she said. They wanted your input before the next evaluation. She set the folder on the counter beside him. About Max? Jake asked. About the incident, she said, and left him there. He hesitated before opening it. Inside were printed pages, medical reports, field notes, training logs. The kind of language meant to sound clinical, but which always carried ghosts between the lines. He skimmed until a familiar name stopped him. Sergeant Daniel Ricks. The handwriting on the training notes beside it was his own. Jake's throat tightened. He remembered the day they'd first tested Max's response to live detonation drills. The dog had performed flawlessly during controlled conditions, tail low, but steady eyes locked on his handler. But during the real simulation, when the blast charges fired in sequence, the echo from the canyon wall had thrown the sound back in chaotic waves. The handler Ricks had turned to call the next command, unaware that Max had already broken formation. Ears, flattened eyes, wide with confusion. By the time Jake reached them, Ricks was down, arm bleeding, shouting for Jake to hold the dog. It hadn't been malice. It had been fear sharpened into instinct. They'd both known it, but paperwork didn't distinguish between the two. The report called it unprovoked aggression. Jake closed the file halfway, the weight of it pressing against his palm. He read further, tracing the notes from the review board. They'd written that the dog was to be reassigned for evaluation, not euthanized, pending temperament testing. And someone had signed the transfer order under his own initials, back when he'd been too numb to read the details. He stared at the signature until the letters blurred. Max had been his responsibility all along. He leaned against the counter, eyes shut. The memory opened wider, spilling sound and color he'd worked years to bury the echo of the blast, the metallic smell of blood, Ricks's voice cracking through static. He remembered kneeling beside them both, one hand on the dog's collar, one hand pressing gauze to his friend's arm, whispering steady words neither of them believed. "Easy, easy, we've got this." He remembered the way Max had trembled after pressed against the ground, not resisting, not understanding. And later, the silence of the transport cage, the dog looking at him through the grid as if waiting for an explanation. Jake rubbed the bridge of his nose and forced the image away. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed louder. He flipped the folder closed and stared at the cover label, Max 4721 GSD MWD program status unfit for service. The word unfit made him think of the people left behind by systems that didn't have patience for healing. He straightened and walked back toward the isolation ward. Max stood when he entered, body shifting slightly, recognizing the sound of his boots. Jake leaned against the metal door. "You remember that day, don't you?" he said softly. The dog didn't move, only blinked. "You're the reason I'm here," Jake went on. "Not accusing, not forgiving, just stating fact. And maybe I'm the reason you are too." Max tilted his head as if catching something in his tone. Jake crouched, elbows on his knees. "I trained you once," he said, "before they passed you to Ricks. You were good, too good, maybe. You followed every order, even the ones that didn't make sense. The memory of Rix's grin flickered again, the way he'd joked that Max had two masters, one for the field, one for the book. Jake had laughed then. He wasn't laughing now. You did what they told you, he said quietly. So did I. That's how we both got here. Max shifted his weight, a low rumble starting in his throat, not anger, but something close to sorrow. Jake lowered his gaze. You don't owe me anything, he said. But maybe we both owe him some peace. The hum of the heater filled the silence. Snow began to fall again outside, soft flakes tapping against the narrow window. Jake stayed there until the shadows lengthened, watching Max breathe, remembering how to do the same. When he finally stood, his knees ached, but his mind was steady. He placed the file on Nora's desk before leaving a note scribbled across the top, recommendation retain for rehabilitation. Handler available to assist. He didn't wait for her reaction. As he walked out to the lot, the wind carried a sound from inside, a short bark, sharp but not hostile, the kind that followed recognition. Jake stopped, hands deep in his jacket pockets. He looked back once at the building, the light in the window like a heartbeat against the gray. I remember too, he said quietly, and this time it didn't hurt to admit it. By the next afternoon, the snow had turned to rain that tapped against the metal roof like a metronome, keeping time with the quiet pulse of the shelter. Jake arrived later than usual, having spent the morning reviewing the new behavioral guidelines Nora had sent him. They were clinical and detached, written for handlers who didn't have memories tied to the animals under their care. He placed the papers aside and started his rounds. Max was awake, pacing slowly, a restless loop of muscle and thought. You and me both, Jake murmured, sliding fresh water into the slot. The dog sniffed, drank, then turned toward the sound of footsteps at the far end of the corridor. Nora appeared, umbrella still dripping. Behind her was a smaller figure wrapped in a raincoat the color of faded yellow. Grace. Her foster mother wasn't with her this time, only Nora. She's here for her session, Nora said. The therapist called in sick, but she insisted on coming anyway. I told her you'd keep an eye out. Jake hesitated. This isn't a great day for visitors. She said she just wants to talk. Nora replied gently. Nothing more. Grace stepped forward before he could answer. Her eyes met his with that same quiet certainty she'd had the first time. Can I? She asked. Jake exhaled slowly. He's unpredictable, Grace. So am I, she said simply. The answer caught him off guard. Nora gave a small shrug, a silent promise of trust, then turned to check on the other kennels. Jake motioned toward Max's cage. Stay by the wall. Don't reach through. Grace nodded, walking closer until she could see the dog's shadow through the bars. Max had stopped pacing. His tail was stiff, his breath quick but not loud. Jake stood beside her, alert, ready to step in. Grace crouched carefully, her knees touching the cold floor. Hi, Max, she said softly. Remember me? The dog's ears twitched. A low growl rolled out, not sharp, but steady, the sound of warning without aggression. Grace didn't flinch. It's okay, she said, voice steady. You don't have to be polite. I had a bad night too. Jake glanced down, uncertain if she was talking to him or the dog. Grace continued, her tone light, almost conversational. I dreamed I was back in the car. It was snowing and my dad was driving. He kept turning the heater higher, saying we'd be fine, that it was just a few more miles. Her fingers curled around the hem of her raincoat. Then there was a sound, loud, like thunder, but inside the car. I woke up before the light went out. Max's growl shifted, softening into a whine that caught at the edges of silence. Grace smiled faintly. I think maybe you don't like loud sounds either. Jake's hands tensed on the bars, his mind echoing with the memory of the explosion, the same pitch of terror translated into another species. He watched Max's breathing slow the rise and fall of his chest, evening out. Grace tilted her head. It's strange, isn't it? How sounds stay even after they stop. The rain hit harder than drumming against the roof. Max's eyes flicked upward, then back to her. She didn't move. You can listen to mine, she whispered. I'll listen to yours. Jake saw the dog's body loosen shoulders, lowering a fraction. The growl faded completely, replaced by a soft huff of breath. He realized he hadn't breathed either. Grace leaned closer, not enough to cross the threshold, just enough for her voice to fill the space. When I can't sleep, I count how long it takes for the thunder to go away, she said. Maybe you could count with me sometime. Max's ears twitched again, his head tilting slightly to one side. He stepped forward, paws silent against the straw, until the bars framed his face in the dim light. Grace stayed still, eyes wide, but calm. Hi, she whispered again. Jake could hear her heartbeat in the quiet. It was that kind of silence, alive, fragile, waiting to choose between fear and trust. Max sniffed the air, his nose inches from the bars. Then he sat down. Jake blinked. It was the first time he'd seen the dog sit in front of anyone but him. Grace's lips curved into the smallest smile. See, that wasn't so bad. She looked up at Jake. Can I come back tomorrow? He hesitated. Torn between protocol and the instinct that said no, manual could explain this kind of progress. We'll see, he said finally. Grace nodded, still looking at Max. Bye, soldier, she said softly, and the word soldier landed in Jake's chest like a spark finding dry tinder. When she left, the rain had slowed, leaving streaks of water on the glass like fading lines of ink. Jake returned to Max's cage, crouched beside it. The dog was calm eyes half closed, breathing even. You remember, don't you? Jake said quietly. What it means when someone talks instead of commands. Max opened his eyes, blinked once, then laid his head on his paws. The sound of the rain faded to a faint whisper. Jake stayed there, not moving, realizing that Grace had done in minutes what months of training had never achieved. She had given silence a purpose again. When he finally stood, he turned off the corridor lights. As he walked out, he heard a single soft thump from behind Max, shifting position, settling deeper into rest. It was the smallest sound of peace, but enough to carry through the dark hallway and follow Jake out into the damp night. That night the wind carried a damp chill from the mountains, heavy with the scent of rain and gun oil from the nearby Marine base. Jake stayed late, double-checking the locks and finishing paperwork Nora had left on his desk. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly, the sound matching the fatigue pulsing behind his eyes. Outside, the last of the rain had stopped, leaving puddles that caught the reflections of the security lamps. He heard the faint rhythm of boots on pavement, from the distance the sound of soldiers running night drills on the training field beyond the trees. The base sometimes held small exercises after dark. Nothing unusual. But tonight the air felt wrong, stretched tight like a line about to snap. From the far kennels came a short bark, then another sharper this time. Max. Jake pushed back his chair instinct, overriding fatigue. When he reached the isolation corridor, Max was pacing, ears flat tail, rigid body trembling with tension. Easy, Jake said quietly, stepping closer. It's just training fire. The dog's eyes flicked toward the small window nostrils, flaring at the faint scent of cordite carried on the wind. Then came the first explosion, dull distant, followed by another. The shock wave rolled through the walls, subtle but deep enough to rattle the metal doors. Max snapped upright claws, scraping the floor. His bark turned to a long, haunting howl that cut through the hall like torn wire. Jake froze, recognizing the pitch, the exact note from that long-ago day in the canyon. Max. He called his voice firm but low. It's not real. You're safe. The next blast came closer, sharper, echoing off the concrete like thunder striking inside the room. Max lunged at the bar's teeth, flashing in the harsh light, paws slamming the steel until the sound became a rhythm of panic. Jake reached for the latch, ready to open the gate enough to calm him, but the memory of Rix's blood flashed in his mind. His hand stopped halfway. He couldn't afford another mistake. Max, stand down, he ordered softly, his voice calm even as his heart hammered. The dog didn't hear him. The next explosion broke something invisible. Max reared, biting at the air, his claws raking against the door, until sparks jumped from the metal. The noise was deafening now, the dog's panic layered over the fading echo of simulated gunfire. Jake took one cautious step back, calculating distance, breath steady. Then he heard another sound, faint but human, a small cry, high and thin, from the direction of the therapy room. His stomach dropped. "Grace!" he shouted, running down the hall. The therapy room door was half open, the lights still on. Grace was there, crouched beside a shelf, hands pressed over her ears, eyes wide. She must have stayed after her session, maybe waiting for her foster mother to pick her up, and no one had realized. Another blast rolled through the valley. She flinched, a sob breaking through. Jake knelt beside her. "It's just practice fire," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "They're safe sounds." "They don't sound safe," she whispered. Her face was wet, not from rain, but tears, the kind that came from fear, remembered rather than lived. He put a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Come on, we're heading to the office. It's quieter there." But then from behind them came the sound again, Max barking and slamming against the cage, voice raw with terror. Grace turned toward it. "He's scared too," she said, standing before Jake could stop her. "Stay here," he ordered, but she was already halfway down the hall. The next bark rattled the air, echoing against the walls. When Jake caught up, Grace was standing a few feet from Max's cage. The dog was frantic, body pressed against the bars, claws raking grooves into the floor. "Max," Jake shouted, voice sharp. "Down." The dog didn't respond. He was lost in the storm of sound. Grace's voice trembling but clear-cut through the noise. "Hey, it's okay," she said louder now. "It's just noise. It's just noise." Her small hands lifted slightly, palms open. Max froze, mid-lunge, muscles tight, breath ragged. His head turned toward her ears, twitching. She stepped closer, one slow inch at a time. "You're not there," she whispered. "You're here. You're okay." The next blast hit, muffled by distance. Max flinched but didn't lunge. Instead, a whine broke from his throat, soft questioning. Grace took another step. "You don't have to be scared. I'm right here." Jake watched, hardly breathing. The girl's words, simple as they were, reached places command tones never could. Max lowered his head, pressing his muzzle against the bars, panting hard. The tremor running through him began to fade. Grace crouched still, keeping space between them. "See," she said softly. "We're both safe now." The next minute stretched long and quiet. Outside, the drills ended. The night went still except for the faint ticking of cooling metal. Jake finally spoke. "Grace, back up slowly," he said. She obeyed, retreating one careful step at a time until she was beside him. He put a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. Max let out one more sound, a low rumble that melted into a sigh, his body sinking to the floor. The silence that followed was almost unreal. Grace looked up at Jake. "He stopped because I talked to him," she said, her voice small but sure. Jake nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He stopped because you reminded him where he was." She smiled faintly, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. "We both needed that." He didn't answer. He just watched the dog through the bars, heart slowing, realizing that fear could be broken, not with control but with gentleness. When he walked Grace to the door, the night was calm again, the sky clear except for a faint haze of smoke over the distant base. He locked up, took one last look down the corridor and saw Max lying still, eyes half open, no longer haunted. The folded paper from Grace's first visit still sat by the wall unmoved. The next morning, sunlight broke through thin clouds, crisp and cold against the damp air. Jake arrived at the center early, his uniform jacket zipped up to his throat. The scent of coffee drifted from the office, but something else filled the room, a silence that felt uneasy. Nora was waiting for him by the counter, a manila folder clutched to her chest. She looked as though she had been standing there for some time. "Command sent this," she said without preamble. "It came through the base this morning." Jake took the folder, scanning the first line. The words hit like a physical blow. Immediate euthanization authorized. Subject K9 Max 4721. Reason: security risk, unstable temperament. He felt the blood drain from his face, his pulse echoing in his temples. "They're serious," Nora continued softly. "They want him transferred to the military facility by noon tomorrow." "He's not a risk," Jake said quietly. "You saw him last night." Nora's eyes flicked away. "Jake, you know how these things work. Once that order's in motion." "They're wrong," he interrupted, voice calm but iron-edged. "He's healing. He's unpredictable," Nora countered, though her tone lacked conviction. "You've done more for him than anyone could, but the base only sees liability." Jake set the folder on the desk, his hand flattening the page as if he could crush the words out of existence. "I'll handle the transfer," he said finally. "I owe him that much." He left the office before she could answer. The drive back to his quarters on base felt longer than usual, the roads glazed with thin ice that glittered under the sun. Every mile was heavy with the weight of unfinished things. At his small desk, he reread the order until the letters blurred into gray lines. The signature at the bottom was from his commanding officer, Major Redding, a man who trusted procedure more than people. Jake stared at it, wondering if loyalty and obedience could still coexist. That night he barely slept. He kept hearing Grace's voice in the hallway, the calm certainty in her tone when she'd told Max, "You're not there. You're here." The memory pressed against him until dawn crept pale across the blinds. By morning, he had made his decision, though he didn't name it yet. He left the base early hours before the transport team was scheduled to arrive. The air smelled of frost and diesel. The world felt hollow, like it was holding its breath. When he pulled into the shelter's lot, the gate was already open. He frowned. Nora was meticulous about locking up. Inside, the lights were on flickering faintly, and the sound that met him wasn't barking. It was quiet, breathing low and steady. He moved quickly through the hall until he reached the isolation ward. The door stood half open. He froze. Inside Max's kennel, the latch was undone, and in the corner, half buried in straw, was Grace. She was sitting cross-legged beside Max, both arms wrapped around his neck. The dog was lying down, head resting against her shoulder, utterly still. Jake's first instinct was panic fear for what the scene would look like if anyone else saw it. "Grace," he said, his voice low but firm. "You can't be in there." She looked up slowly, her eyes calm despite the situation. "He's fine," she said. "He was shaking when I got here. I just stayed until he stopped." "You shouldn't have come without your mother," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The gate was open," she said simply. "I wanted to see him before they take him away." Jake exhaled the sound halfway between a sigh and surrender. "You know about that?" She nodded. "Nora was crying on the phone last night. I heard her say they were coming." She looked back at Max. "He's scared." The dog's chest rose and fell beneath her hand, slow and steady. Jake stepped closer, careful not to startle either of them. "Grace, I need you to come out," he said. "He's calm now, but we can't risk." She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. If someone has to be scared, let it be me." The words stopped him cold. She was trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the kind of conviction that belongs to those who have already faced the worst. Jake swallowed hard. "He won't hurt you," he said. It wasn't a command. It was a truth. "I know," she said. He just needed someone not to run. For a long moment, the three of them stayed frozen in that fragile peace, the soldier, the child, and the dog bound by silence. The fluorescent light flickered once, painting them all in a pale glow. Max shifted his weight, pressing his head closer to Grace's chest, a sigh rumbling low in his throat. Jake took a careful step back. "Stay there," he said softly. "I'll take care of this." She looked up confused. "What do you mean?" "Just stay with him," he said. He left before she could ask more, striding toward the office. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen lighting his face with cold light. When Major Redding's name appeared, he hesitated only a second before ending the call before it could connect. He stood there, the quiet hum of the shelter filling his ears. For once, he didn't feel like a Marine following orders. He felt like a man choosing which parts of himself to save. Behind him, from the isolation room, came a sound, not a bark, not a growl, but the slow rhythm of a dog breathing in sync with the heartbeat of a child. The morning arrived with a silence too heavy to be peace. The snow had hardened overnight into glassy sheets that cracked under every step. Jake parked by the gate, his breath fogging the windshield as he watched the sky lighten above the hills. He had barely slept. Every thought returned to that image, Grace sitting inside the kennel, her arms around Max as if she could hold back the whole world. The transport team from the base was scheduled to arrive within the hour. He had told Nora he would handle the preparation himself, that it would be better if no one else was involved. When he entered the building, the sound of the heaters filled the air steady and indifferent. Max's ward was quiet, though he could sense movement beyond the metal door. He opened it slowly. Grace was still there, half asleep against Max's shoulder, the dog lying still beside her. They looked like survivors resting after a long storm. "Grace," Jake said gently. Her eyes opened unfocused at first, then sharp with recognition. "You came," she whispered. "You need to go home," he said. "Your foster mother must be worried." She shook her head. "I promised him I'd stay until he wasn't scared anymore." Her voice was small, but resolute. Jake stepped closer, lowering his tone. "You did good. He's calm now. But the others are coming. You can't be here when they do." Max lifted his head at the word others, a low sound vibrating in his throat. Jake glanced at him. "It's all right, boy," he said. "Nobody's here to hurt her." But he wasn't sure he believed that anymore. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Nora followed by Cole and another staff member. "Carter," Nora called softly. "They're early. The van's outside." Jake turned tension coiling in his chest. "Give me 5 minutes." Nora hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful." When she left, Jake crouched near the cage hand on the latch. "Grace," he said, "I'm going to open this so you can come out. Stay calm and move slow." She nodded, eyes wide. "Will they take him?" "Not if I can help it," he said, though the words felt like sand in his mouth. He lifted the latch. The door creaked open an inch. Grace began to crawl forward, but Max moved too, sensing danger, reading the tension in the air. In one swift motion, he surged through the opening body, blocking her path. Jake stepped back, heart hammering. Cole appeared at the far end of the hall, froze when he saw the dog loose. "Jake!" he shouted. "He's out!" Nora rushed forward. "Don't move." The narrow corridor filled with noise, shouts, the metallic scrape of a chair, the high whine of fear. Max stood between them. All ears forward, tail stiff, eyes locked on Jake. His muscles rippled beneath his coat, every instinct alive. Jake's hand went to his belt, pulling free the Taser standard issue for animal control. Easy, he said, voice steady but loud enough to cut through the chaos. Stay where you are. Nora grabbed Cole's sleeve, pulling him back. Let him handle it, she hissed. Grace was frozen behind Max, hands trembling but still. Don't hurt him, she whispered. Jake's grip tightened on the taser. Nobody has to get hurt, he said. The air felt electric, heavy with potential. Max's gaze flicked from Jake to Grace, then back again. He took one step forward, slow, deliberate, the sound of his claws on the floor sharp as a heartbeat. Jake raised the taser halfway, his stance firm, every reflex screaming preparation, but something in the dog's eyes stopped him. It wasn't fury. It was focus. Max lowered his head, body sinking slightly, tail dropping in submission. Then, to everyone's disbelief, he moved sideways until his body shielded Grace completely. Jake's breath caught. The dog wasn't preparing to attack, he was guarding her. Max. Jake said quietly, lowering the taser an inch. Stand down. The command hung in the air. Max blinked once, a slow acknowledgement. He didn't move closer, didn't growl. He simply stayed between them, steady, like a wall of patience. Grace reached out, touching his back lightly. He's protecting me, she whispered. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he lowered the weapon fully. I see that, he said. The hallway went still. Nora exhaled audibly, the sound of a held breath finally released. Cole took a step forward. What do we do? He asked. Nothing, Jake said. We wait. Slowly he knelt, lowering himself to the dog's level eyes, never leaving Max's. You know me, he said softly. You've known me longer than anyone here. Max's ears twitched. You did your job, Jake continued. Now let me do mine. For a long suspended second, no one moved. Then Max exhaled a low sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. He turned his head toward Grace, gave a brief whine, and took one step back. Grace looked up at Jake, waiting for his cue. Come to me, he said quietly. She slipped out from behind Max and crossed the space, her small hand finding his sleeve. Jake stood slowly, keeping his eyes on the dog. Max stayed where he was, head bowed slightly as if awaiting an order that no longer mattered. Jake holstered the taser. Good boy, he said, voice rough. Max's tail flicked once, just enough to disturb the dust. Nora placed a hand over her mouth, eyes glistening. I've never seen anything like that, she whispered. Jake didn't answer. He knew what it meant, though he couldn't yet name it. Something had shifted. A choice had been made, not just by him, but by the animal who now stood quiet in the center of the hall, unchained, but perfectly still. Outside, the rumble of the arriving transport vehicle echoed through the cold air. Jake turned toward the sound, the weight of decision pressing hard against his ribs. He looked back once more at Max, still standing guard, and understood that some orders were not meant to be followed. For a long moment after the shouting stopped, there was only breathing, the shallow kind that comes after panic when everyone is afraid to be the first to move. Jake stood frozen, the taser still in his hand, its small red light steady against the pale wall. Max stayed in the center of the hallway, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. Grace clung to Jake's sleeve, her heartbeat trembling through the fabric. It's okay, Jake said softly. He's not going to hurt anyone. The words weren't for the staff, they were for himself. He looked at Max, really looked, and saw not fury or fear, but exhaustion. The dog's eyes met his with the weight of recognition, like two soldiers realizing they had been fighting the same war from opposite sides. Jake exhaled, then crouched slowly, setting the taser on the floor. It landed with a soft clack, the red light fading out. All right, boy, he said, voice low but steady. Let's finish this the way we started. He straightened his posture slightly and gave the old command, the one Max hadn't heard in more than a year. Sit. Max blinked once, then obeyed. He lowered himself to the floor in one smooth motion, head high, eyes locked on Jake. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Nora took a step forward, whispering, "He's responding." Jake nodded, throat tight. He remembers. He gave another quiet order, hand signal, sharp but calm. "Stay." Max held the position without hesitation. Grace let out a small breath, relief and wonder mingling on her face. "He's listening to you," she said. Jake didn't answer. His mind had already begun to move, calculating what this moment could mean. "Nora," he said quietly, "is the security camera still recording?" She glanced up at the red light above the corridor door. "It's been on since last night." "Good," Jake said. "Don't erase anything." He placed a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. "Go wait in the office with Nora, all right?" She hesitated. "You're not going to let them take him, are you?" Jake met her gaze, and something in his expression made her nod before he even spoke. "Not today," he said. When they were gone, he knelt again beside Max. "You did fine," he said quietly. "Better than any of us deserved." Max leaned forward slightly enough for his nose to brush Jake's sleeve, then settled again. It wasn't affection, exactly, but it was something close, a gesture of trust returned. Jake stood feeling the heaviness of command without rank duty, without orders. He retrieved the taser from the floor, safety clicked on, and holstered it. The sound of the transport van outside broke the moment. 2 men in uniforms entered carrying a transfer crate. "We're here for the K9," one said. Jake blocked the doorway. "Not today," he said. The man frowned. "We have orders." "So did I," Jake replied, and those orders just changed. His tone was firm enough to make them pause. "You can wait in the lobby," he said. "Or you can call the major. Either way, you're not taking that dog until I've sent my report." They exchanged looks, muttering, but did as told. When they left, Jake pulled his phone from his pocket. He scrolled through the shelter's camera feed, downloading the footage. Every second of it, Grace in the cage, Max's breakout, his stance the moment he shielded the child, all of it was there, unedited truth. He wrote the accompanying message carefully. "Major Redding, you asked for proof of stability. Attached is footage recorded, 0730 hours. Subject did not attack. Demonstrated restraint and protective instinct. Recommend reassessment of termination order. Request approval for reclassification therapy. K9 for dependent youth." He stared at the words before hitting send. The minutes that followed stretched thin as wire. The van engine idled outside, a steady growl under the ticking clock. Grace waited in the office, hands folded, eyes darting between Nora and the window. Finally, Jake's phone buzzed. He opened the reply. 3 lines, short and clear, footage reviewed. Termination rescinded. Authorization granted for reclassification. Report to base with subject for evaluation. He exhaled the air, leaving his chest like a weight finally allowed to fall. He walked to the office, holding up the phone. Nora's hand went to her mouth when she saw the message. Grace blinked. "He can stay," she whispered. "He can stay," Jake said. Her face broke into a smile that trembled around the edges. She ran down the corridor before he could stop her, stopping just short of Max's kennel. The dog lifted his head as she crouched. "You did it," she whispered, though she didn't know who she was speaking to, Jake, Max, or something larger that had carried them both. Jake watched them, realizing that in saving the dog, they had somehow all been rescued a little. Nora stepped beside him, voice quiet. "What now?" "Now," he said, still watching Max and Grace. "Now we teach him how to help others the way she helped him." Outside, the van's engine finally shut off, the men climbing out, confused but obedient. The air felt cleaner, lighter. Jake looked down at his hands, still trembling faintly. "Guess that's a first," he said softly, half to himself. A Marine following his heart instead of his orders. The weeks that followed moved slower, the days blending into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. The snow melted into patches of soft mud, the air carrying the faint smell of thawed earth. The shelter had changed too, less echo, more laughter. Grace came less often now, her therapist saying progress was best measured in quiet nights, not visits. Nora told Jake one morning while sorting files that Grace's foster mother had called. "She's sleeping through the night," Nora said, her voice carrying something gentle beneath the practical tone. "No more nightmares. Said she keeps a photo of Max by her bed." Jake smiled faintly, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes but softens them anyway. "Good," he said. "That's what we wanted." Later that week, a letter arrived addressed in a child's uneven handwriting. It came folded twice, the paper smudged from the pressure of a pencil. Inside, a short note. "Dear Jake, Max isn't scary anymore. He's brave. I think you are too. From Grace." There was a small drawing beneath it, 2 stick figures and a large dog standing between them. Jake stared at it for a long time before placing it carefully in his wallet beside his old service photo. He didn't need to read it again to remember the words. They settled in his mind like a quiet promise. The next morning, Max's new role began. The military had approved the therapy program, small-scale, still experimental, meant for children of service members coping with trauma. Jake had volunteered to oversee the first sessions, arguing that no one else understood Max's rhythms the way he did. The training facility was a converted hangar on base, its echo softened by rugs and low walls painted in muted colors. The space smelled faintly of disinfectant and hope. Max sat near Jake's side, harness-polished badge stitched neatly, K9 therapy unit. He looked different now. Healthier coat, full eyes, alert, but calm. Still, there was a tension in the air, as if both handler and dog were aware of the thin line between past and present. The first group arrived quietly, 3 children accompanied by parents and counselors. The youngest, a boy with dark hair and a limp, stared at Max from behind his mother's leg. Jake knelt beside the dog. "Easy, buddy," he whispered. "We take it slow." Max stayed perfectly still. The boy's mother nodded encouragement, and slowly the child stepped forward, hand trembling. When his fingers brushed Max's fur, the dog didn't move. He simply lowered his head, letting the boy's small hand rest between his ears. The boy smiled, a shy, uncertain thing, and for the first time, Jake saw the change reflected not in the animal, but in the child. The session lasted less than an hour, simple introductions, quiet gestures, soft commands. When it ended, Max lay at Jake's feet, eyes half closed, the calm of work well done. Nora stopped by clipboard in hand. "You know," she said, watching the departing families, "they'll write about this one day. The Marine and the dog who taught each other how to stay." Jake shook his head, smiling. "We're just doing the job." "Maybe," she said. "But some jobs save more than one life." When she left, the hangar fell into the quiet hum of distant engines and the faint rattle of chains in the wind. Jake crouched beside Max, resting one hand on the dog's head. "You did good today," he said softly. Max leaned into the touch, his tail brushing the floor once-twice. The old scars on his leg were still visible, pale against the dark fur, but they no longer looked like wounds. They looked like reminders, proof of something survived. Jake stayed like that for a while, the quiet stretching between them. He thought about Rix, about Grace, about the noise and the silence that had shaped all of them. "You're not broken, buddy," he whispered finally. "You're just learning to be brave again." Max blinked slowly as if answering and pressed his head a little harder against Jake's hand. Outside, the last of the snow dripped from the roof, forming a steady rhythm against the concrete, a sound that no longer carried fear. Jake stood, clipping the leash, readying for another day. "Come on," he said. "We've got work to do." They walked out together into the thin sunlight, two shadows merging into one, the door closing softly behind them. The world wasn't fixed, not completely, but it was better. And sometimes Jake thought that was enough. If this story touched, you don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more true stories of courage, loyalty, and second chances. Tell me in the comments, what moment hit you the hardest? Was it when Jake chose heart over orders, or when Max finally found peace? And where are you watching from tonight? I'd love to see how far this story travels.